Yeah, we are here to celebrate Andrew's book, Better Boys, Better Men. Andrew Reiner is joining us from. Do you live in Baltimore?
I live outside of Baltimore.
Outside of Baltimore. Do you live in Towson?
So I used to live in Towson. I used to live in Towson, and I now live in an area called Frederick, which is a
Got it.
little bit west of Baltimore. Yeah.
Okay. When I saw you were from Towson, I have to tell you I went to college at Goucher. Down the street.
Yeah, right down the street. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I think most folks are here, and I'm sure some more will trickle in. But thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for Andrew Reiner's talk with Dr. Nemko, our amazing superintendent of Napa County. She has been our superintendent since 1997. Oh, wait, let me rewind, tell you some rules before I start her bio. Everybody's on mute. Stay that way until we have our Q&A at the last 10 minutes or so. Feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout the event, and they will be answered if relevant through the event, otherwise at the Q&A. We recommend having a speaker view so that the person talking will be the big face. And just a quick plug for an event coming up later this month. Ray Gadani has written a book about the murder of Anita Fagiani, which many of you know about, and everybody has wondered what happened with this really awful case. He wrote a whole book about it. He was the presiding judge of this case, so he has a really fascinating, informative take on it. That is later this month, January 28th or so. Cool. So tonight, Dr. Barbara Nemo is our amazing superintendent. She has been our superintendent since 1997, and she has done everything you can imagine. And her bio is extremely impressive and extremely long, and I'm going to send you a link to it so you can just Google and ogle because it's so impressive. I'm just going to read you a personal note. I loved her personal part of her bio. In her spare time, she enjoys doing community theater and has played roles including a Swedish psychic, a jealous Italian wife, a Jewish mother from New York, and a has-been Hollywood star, among others. She has 2 granddaughters, ages 9 and 7, and will happily tell you stories and show you pictures until you can escape her clutches. And if you don't know her, get to know her. She is a person. And I met her because she spearheads Napa County Reads, which is an annual event to get middle schoolers all reading the same book. And then she invites the author to speak in the schools and then have an open public event. So getting kids reading is a huge passion of hers. All right, without further ado, Barbara, Dr. Nemko, I will let you introduce Andrew.
Thank you, Naomi. I am delighted to be here and to introduce Andrew Reiner, who is a professor at Towson University, where he teaches a seminar called The Changing Face of Masculinity. He has written about masculinity and men's issues for lots of places, including the New York Times, for the La Repubblica, the Washington Post magazine, et cetera, and he speaks about it in many different places and locations, just like he's speaking to us tonight. So Andrew, for starters, I'm thinking when you were a little kid and your aunt came over and she pinched your cheek and she said, "Hello, sweetheart, what do you want to be when you grow up?" It probably wasn't a professor of masculinity. So tell us how you got involved in this and how you entered into this very interesting career.
Well, thank you, Barb. Let me just say, first of all, that I appreciate the fact that you're bringing in one of your community theater characters into the question. I hope you will bring all of them into your questions tonight. I think we all would appreciate that. It started out actually at a very young age. With a lot of boys, you're constantly having to prove yourself. You're having to prove yourself, to be like a burgeoning man. And so for me, that really, the crucible began when I was about 7 or 8. I got into this really brutal fight with this neighborhood boy, brutal by our standards completely. And so what happened was the boy had just pummeled me, absolutely pummeled me. And I come home thinking that I'm going to get, some kind of succor. I'm going to be taken care of. My brothers are going to stand up for me. I don't know what that looks like, but they're going to do something to stand up for me. And I come home and I hear my oldest brother yelling to my mother, telling her what a coward I am, what a black sheep I am. And so this went on for months, where it was just basically, a smear campaign. And so throughout the rest of my childhood, adolescence, even into adulthood, any chance my oldest brother could, he would try to find ways to make little kind of jokes, about what a coward I was and all those kinds of things. And so for a long time afterwards, when I was a kid, I got into a lot of fights. And what I was really doing was I was basically trying to fight my way out of the shame. I was trying to fight my way back to his good graces. And I was just as feisty and as fiery as that brother, but I went the opposite direction. And what I did was that, once I stopped fighting, I basically started paying attention and realizing that there were a lot of ways that boys are taught to be boys and eventually men that really just didn't seem to square with me at all. It didn't feel right. And so what happened was, I ended up really kind of pushing back every chance I could against not just my brother, but against a lot of boys who were very kind of hyper masculine and really trying to impose that on other boys. So sometimes that would mean me standing up to them and pushing back against them. And sometimes it meant me standing up for other boys, that were getting picked on. And so when I got older, it was very much in the fore of my became very much part of my identity. It became eventually a very conscious thing. And so I started teaching, and where I teach at Towson, I teach it in the Honors College as well. And the dean of the Honors College was looking for new courses. And I just written an essay for the Washington Post magazine about crying, about this like small scale crusade that I suddenly found myself in, with feeling like I wanted to be okay with, crying, as a man, being okay with crying. And if it happened in public, I would be okay with that. And so that kind of got me thinking a lot about this topic, because it was something that when I really thought about it had really become a very important part of my identity. So I started teaching this seminar you mentioned, Changing Face of Masculinity. And then my son is born. I get married a couple of years later. I have a son. And this crusade that I'd been on for myself was no longer just mine. And suddenly it hit me like square in the face, where I've got a son. And suddenly I've got to come to terms with everything I've been fighting against in my own little small crusade. Now I've got a son, and this is going to change everything. Because now it's either me imposing my own crusade on him, which I know I didn't want to do, but I also didn't want to throw him to the wolves. I didn't want to just say, well, let other boys and men raise you. That's not going to happen. So I had to think of very conscious, deliberate ways that I had to kind of come to terms with my own crusade and how this was going to impact my own son. And it really kind of forced me to really focus and clarify what all of this meant and what was really going to be important for having a son and raising a boy who would hopefully, God willing, become a man.
So in the book, you talk a lot about how parents, and particularly dads, talk to their sons, and the whole issue of how they help to form their son's identity. Talk a little bit about that and how it's different from how they talk to daughters.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that I started realizing very early on, my wife was always reminding me of this, my wife, Elizabeth, and, my son was constantly, as he got older, he's 9 now, but when he was probably 3 or 4, she would say, he's watching you a lot. He's watching you. He would watch my wife for things, but he would just constantly watch me. And she was right. as he's gotten older, he watches me all the time for every little thing to see how I'm going to react to things. That's a huge responsibility. We know that as parents, right? So that really became for me kind of this awareness. And so when I started reading books with him, when he was a toddler, he was really a baby, but then, I started reading a lot more when he was a toddler. And I started noticing that the books, they were wonderful books, but so often the way that the father characters were engaging with the little child characters versus the mother characters was very different. And so, I noticed that the mothers were always the ones who were doing the nurturing. The mothers were ones who were, the emotional providers and the caretakers. The fathers were these characters who tended to be taking little boys on adventures. They were always taking them on adventures. They were sometimes in the older books, they'd be the ones providing the discipline. And that really kind of got me thinking a lot, because I thought, this is exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to push back against. And so what I started doing was, once in a while, I would work in, when there was a book about basically a mother and a child, especially a boy, and she was the emotional caretaker for all of that, I would just change the mother to a father, so that my son was hearing, here's a character from a book who is showing lots of nurturing and affectionate love to this little boy character, and it's a father. Because there were no books as recently as 5-6 years ago that were really representing males that way. And so what happened was, so I'd written about something on this topic for the New York Times, and when I started doing research, sure enough, there were some studies out there that bore this out, that fathers are much more likely to do rough and tumble play with their sons. They don't do that as much with their daughters. Fathers are, in the study, they were much more likely to use words that were a little bit more analytical with their daughters of that age. But with sons, they were using words that really were about competition. Words like top and wan. And they were using these words that not only were they about competition, but really when you looked at some of the words, they spoke actually to domination. It's about being number one. And so there were a lot of these kinds of things. And one of the ones that stuck out the most to me, as being the father of a young son at the time, was that the fathers were getting up when the daughters were crying, but they weren't getting up when the sons were crying in these studies.
Really?
And that broke I have to say, Barb, that one broke my heart. It really did. And so these were the kinds of things that I started realizing. And so, as time went on and I was doing more research and I started doing the book, what I realized was that it is mostly fathers that have a very different way of talking to their sons. And I would interview boys from basically middle school through high school, through college, and even men, talking with them about their fathers and how they grew up talking with them. And for some of them, it hadn't been that long ago. And really 201, the messages, it was really very much a kind of binary. Very much the fathers were talking to them about the need to always do things by themselves as they got older. One student I had, I taught at Towson, was a great example. He was a Division I lacrosse player. And he said when he was in high school, he would be in one room doing his homework, and his twin sisters, who were a few years younger, would be doing their homework. And he would call out to his father and say, "Can you help me with this?" And the father would say, "Look, you're old enough now, you need to be doing this on your own." And he also even said to him, "Look, you're a guy, you need to learn how to do this stuff on your own." And he would go to the twin sisters and he would help them whenever they called him, and he was happy to do it. And I said, "Well, so let me ask you this: do you know if your father still did that as your sisters got older?" And he said, "Yeah, absolutely." And I said, "So how does that sit with you? I'm curious if that bothers you at all, because you're a guy, you're a big lacrosse player." And he said, "Of course it bothers me." He said, "Of course I would have liked my father to come in to help me. To this day, I wish he would have come in and helped me." And so these are the kinds of messages that a lot of dads are still giving their sons. And there was research in the book that I talk about that there are a lot of moms, frankly, that unwittingly as well sometimes contribute to these scripts too. There's a great researcher. His name is Edward Tronic. And I read a lot about him in this one chapter called How We Talk to Boys. And Tronic has done these studies since the late 1970s, and he still does them. And it's always been with moms and their infant children. And all of his studies have shown that for decades, when he has it's called a still face paradigm, where you have the mother facing the infant. And the studies have always shown, decades in and decades out, that moms, when they show greater stoicism and they don't engage with the babies, the little boys are always much, much more irritable. They're reaching out for their mothers. They're trying to get out of the chair. They're crying. They're irritable. They get fussy. They get angry. And the little girls handle it much, much better. And that's one of the things that we really don't look at for instance, in parenting and in education. That's a big one, because boys right, the hemisphere of their brains develops much more slowly. And the big problem with that is emotional regulation. We tend to think of boys as being the ones, they're the ones that can handle it. They're tougher. They're more resilient. Boys don't need as much nurturing in the classroom. It's just the opposite. The social script that is so ingrained in our culture with boys, they learn it, they absorb it, they suck it up, they take it in, and they have to fight with themselves to just keep everything under wraps. But they're really the ones, ironically, who really need the most emotional scaffolding. And I really do think that that's the reason why that so many boys in classrooms struggle one of the reasons they struggle so much when they're acting out. They are falling behind. They don't know how else to ask for help because they feel like they're not supposed to ask for help and they shouldn't be asking for help. And they feel disconnected. They feel disconnected because they're falling behind and they don't want to feel like pariahs. And so this is a way to get strokes that work in a classroom with other children.
I'm thinking that we've all heard both parents say to boys, if the boy falls and he's crying, you'll hear a parent say, "Oh, boys don't cry. Come on, tough it out. Be a big boy." And that probably, if that's the message that you get all your life, clearly you're going to internalize that. And that's going to be very hard, where a girl falls and we say, "Oh, sweetheart, oh, pat, hug, love." We don't tell girls, tough it out, be a big girl. Maybe some parents do, but typically that's more directed at boys. So I know you quoted some statistics in the book about the rates of depression and suicide, the difference between boys and girls today. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So the research, and you could easily, we could easily just go online and Google this, and the research shows when you go online, the industry standard is, women, young women and older women get depressed at a rate of about 2 to 1 to men, 2 times as likely. But there have been there's increasing body of research. And one of the first studies started in 2014 when it came out with the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, Psychiatry. And what they did was they found that when they used a scale of gauging depression, they used a traditional and a non-traditional. And let me just backtrack for 1 second. The traditional scale is what a lot of practitioners in mental health have always used. What happens is that they use a scale that actually gauges depression in women extremely well. It measures things like ennui. It measures things like loss of appetite, lack of focus, lots of crying and lots of sadness. Boys and men some of them do experience depression that way. But a lot of boys and men experience depression in ways that look really different. Much greater irritability, which means more likelihood to lash out more quickly. Much greater hostility, not surprising. Engaging in far riskier behaviors than they normally would. Leaning a lot more into exercise, leaning a lot more into their jobs. Because these are ways that are sanctioned, that are okay for guys to take out their sadness and their suffering and put it into places that are sanctioned and say, well, yeah, exercising, working out, being at your job, throwing yourself more and more into your job. These are much more acceptable ways of doing it. And it's not that guys even know this, but it's so ingrained that this is a way that they can not deal with the depression. And so what happened was, in these studies, when they now integrate less traditional ways of gauging depression with the traditional ways, they found, you know what? It's not 2 to 1. That in fact, those numbers are far, far closer for men and women than they thought that they were. In one of the JAMA studies they did there, I think there were 2 of them. In the second one, they actually said that the men and the men using the traditional and non-traditional scales actually were coming out just a little bit higher in the participants versus the women. And one of the things I also came across was research. I was so glad to see this, Barb. There was a group, and I can't remember the name of it, but a group of educators who teach. They do when you have to do kind of extension learning for people who are engaged in the mental health field. And they said, one of the things that they talked about was this need to start looking at depression very differently than we have in the past, and to start looking at ways that boys and men experience depression that is not the way we've been taught to look at it. So, and we're seeing this tenfold with the pandemic. There is a lot more anxiety and depression in boys than I think. It's the sad thing is there's a lot more with boys and men than we thought that there was with anxiety and depression. The good thing is there's really nowhere to hide with the pandemic going on, and it's really kind of coming out full bore, and so it's forcing the hand. There's a much bigger conversation now than there was before the pandemic online, with a lot of young men especially finding ways that they can seek help and talking with each other, which is a tremendous first start. It really is.
I think there are lots more conversations about mental health in general since the pandemic, but we got a really interesting question in the chat, which is, do you think that the way boys are is isolated to Americans and kind of our ideas that we're rugged individualists, and so therefore boys have to be on their own? Or do we see this playing out in Europe and other countries in the same way?
American masculinity is different. When you look at other cultures, it is different. It's similar in some ways, and it's very different in others. American masculinity is if you had kind of a spectrum or a scale, American masculinity would be at one far end of it, because it's much more rigid and much less forgiving than masculinities in a lot of other cultures. So to give you an example, what I'm talking about, the people at the cutting edge of the depression in men and the men's suicide have been the Aussies, the Australians. They really have been the ones who have been at the cutting edge of all this. And the Brits are just behind them. They're doing a great job with this too. When you look at masculinity in those cultures, it's a little bit different in Australia than it is in England. Australians and Americans are a little bit more alike. But if you visit Australia or you learn more about their culture, even though there are some similarities with masculinity in terms of a little bit more of that rugged individualism with Australia and America, Australian men are also more likely to be more affectionate with each other. The only time we see, American men being really affectionate with each other is when they're rip-roaring drunk, and they've got their arms all over each other at football games. It's the truth. And
they pat each other's rear end in football games. There's a lot of that.
Yeah, but you will see Australian men, even though there is more hypermasculinity than, say, in England, you still will see there's much more tenderness with their sons. They will hug their sons. They will show openly, be demonstrative with their sons. You don't see that as much with dads in this culture. And that's just one example. I could keep going on with different cultures. We are a much, much more rigid, less forgiving masculinity, where the expectations are around the clock. You constantly have to be thinking about what you're saying, what you're doing, because you cannot betray any degree of vulnerability without feeling like you're going to be pounced upon.
So let's talk a little bit about in school. One of the things that we have noticed just as teachers, boys will rarely confide in each other and yet they are more comfortable. They will confide in girls.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we explain that?
That's a great question. So this is not something I'm not at all convinced, and I've been researching this book, for 3.5 years. And I'm not at all convinced that this is something that is a men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing. This is not the wiring, because I'll just say from the outset that there's a lot of new neuro research that shows that when you look at brains of all genders and at gender identities across the board, it's a mosaic. 98% of the human brain, there's similar structural similarities and genetic similarities. It's 98%. So I really don't believe that this really is a neuro difference. The difference is that, and I found this to be true, Barb, across the board when I was interviewing boys and young men and even older men from my book. Constantly, I was hearing the same exact thread, which is what you were talking about. Which I'd say to them, okay, so when you've got problems, who do you talk to? Do you have guys that you'll talk to? Oh yeah, of course. Okay, so what does that look like? I'd ask them. Well, when I've got a problem, I will talk about a specific thing. What kind of thing will you talk about? Always they would talk about things, and I came up with this term that I use: targeted transparency. They will very deliberately and intentionally pick something that they know they won't be judged for, that they will share, and that what they really were asking for and that they wanted were solutions and advice. And I'd say, okay. And there were a lot of other things they wouldn't bring up because they felt like they'd be judged if they did bring them up. So there was that targeted transparency with their guy friends. And I'd say, okay, good. So you've got somebody you can talk to about those things. But what about when you feel like you need emotional support? Do you ever feel like you need it? Almost all the guys said yes. Where did they go? Girls who were friends, girlfriends, right? Female partners, wives, across the board. It started in high school and it went all the way through adulthood. To a one, it was like that. And so, there were one or two boys who told me they shared something about with girls. And that was actually encouraging to hear. But a lot of it, where does this come from? Because boys do not feel that they have these networks of friends that they feel safe with. And let me explain what I mean by that. So one of the things I've written a lot about, and there's a piece I just did in the New York Times about men and being emotional safety nets. And I wrote a lot about this in the book on men and their relationships and their loneliness. There is inherent to the way that we're taught to bond and to create friendships. There's an inherent kind of competition. And we're not talking about competition like, this friend is trying to steal my girlfriend. It's nothing like that overt. It's much more subtle with guys. It's a bunch of guys hanging out in a group together, and they're just kind of joking around and ragging on each other. That's a form of competition, because when guys sit around and bust each other's chops, as they like to call it, or they just rag on each other, or they're just kind of, this is the way they bond, and they're just no foul, no harm. What they're doing is creating a dynamic where they're making one guy look like they're making, at the expense of themselves, they're making somebody else look bad. Even if it's just in jest, it's a pattern. And so that's an example of the kind of competition, because what you're doing is you're diminishing one other guy's status at the expense of trying to raise yours. And what that does is that creates an environment where guys feel like, you know what? When I've got something I really need to unload, I can't trust these guys. I don't know how they're going to react. I'm going to be laughed at, which is probably the biggest thing you're going to fear, the rejection. I'm going to be judged. Why would they open themselves up to that? Because there is this inherent feeling of competition that we expect boys to have. And we expect that, it's part of who they are, the way that they bond with each other. And so there's really, what happens is there's a level of distrust. And that's why, that's a really very strong reason why so many males will turn to females when they feel like they need to talk. There are a lot of younger gay men I interviewed who did the same thing. This wasn't just straight guys. A lot of younger gay men will turn to females as well when they feel like they really need to kind of unload and really open up and maybe get sad and maybe cry. because they feel like even with a lot of gay men, they feel like, if they have some female friends that they can do that with, it's safer.
Oh, good. I was thinking the straight guys are doing that because they figure then the women may be more inclined to have sex with them.
That's an old TV trope, Barb.
Okay, so we have an interesting question here. How much do you think pop culture influences the current problematic masculinity, and how can we change that? How do we change that?
Yeah, I think here's the thing. We're in a time of making some progress with that. And I'll talk about the pop culture in just one second. But there are a lot of younger men who are really kind of redefining their identity with traditional masculinity. They are forming friendships where they're not just bonding, over drinking and watching sports and playing poker, which is the way, by the way, a lot of guys I interviewed in the book are doing that. And these are educated guys. These aren't like, working class guys where we expect them to do that. A lot of guys feel much safer and much more comfortable bonding over very stereotypical ways where they don't have to really talk. But a lot of younger guys are getting better at that. The term, we probably have all heard that as bromance, where they'll do things with guys, and there's a lot of self-care involved with younger men. They really embrace their appearance and self-care much more than guys who are like Gen X and baby boomers do. That said, there are a lot of messages in pop culture that younger men get that are very, very deleterious to their well-being. And one of the biggest ones is the action hero movies they all consume. And so I would ask a lot of the younger men that I would interview from high school to college especially, to what extent these guys look to them as role models. And the conversation always started out with, well, it's entertainment. I don't really take all that stuff too seriously. But when I'd say to them, okay, so what is it about them that you really admire, that you wish you had, that maybe you don't? Always it was the body, right? And there's a huge amount of body dysmorphia with these guys, huge amount. The fact that they were very cocky, they always had just the right thing to say to a person when another person was trying to make them look bad. They always felt like they always had an answer. They were always in control. And these guys were always saying things like, I don't always have a great comeback. I don't always know what to say at the right time. I don't always feel like I'm in control of situations, and I don't feel like I've never been in a fight before. So I don't know, like these guys that I really admire on the screen who are buffed and can take care of themselves. I'm really worried that I can do that. And this is part of an old script. This idea about always having to be in control, always, having the pithy or smart thing to say to shut somebody down, and being able to physically assert yourself. This is all part of that old script. And these are ways that a lot of that old hypermasculinity is still being sold to these guys.
Interesting, because I think about all the women who look at movie stars in these airbrushed photos, and we're always lacking because these people are much prettier and they have much greater bodies. And then we feel inadequate because we can't live up to some very unrealistic airbrushed degree of perfection.
That's right.
So one of the things I found particularly interesting in the book was a program in one of the high schools that you visited called the BAM program, Becoming a Man, and what they are doing to help boys. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. That's a program, by the way, that I really have come to believe from all my research. I really believe programs like that need to be in every single school. Okay, so the Becoming a Man BAM program started in Chicago, in some Chicago public schools. It's by a group called Youth Guidance, and they do amazing work in Chicago. That program has been so successful and has done such great work that they now have branched out in cities like LA and in Boston. So the Becoming a Man program is voluntary, but it really draws on so many boys and young men in the public schools in Chicago now, because so many of them want to get involved in it because they see the athletes doing it. And the athletes, especially the basketball and the football players, are the ones in those communities that have the higher status. So one of the things that that youth guidance realize is that the way to make a program successful that is voluntary is you get the boys with the high status involved, and then the other one's going to follow. That's just textbook 101. That's the way you motivate them. I mean, like, this is true for all boys, and it probably is to some extent for girls too. So what they do in these classes is they meet once a week. It's a regular class meeting time. It's not before school. It's not after school. It's during class time. And man, it is well worth it. They only meet once a week for one class. And what they do is they sit in a circle. And this is what all the really good men's groups do. But they use that configuration of a circle, which, as I point out in the book, is really important for boys and men. Because when you are in a circle, you cannot hide. There is no escape valve in a circle. You are forced to sit there and face other people, other boys and men, no less, and learn how to talk about yourself and your internal life in ways that a lot of them have never done it, let alone in front of the dynamic of other boys and men who they know outside of that room could easily cut them to shreds and betray them and talk about the things that they shared. I mean, talk about a lack of trust that's potentially there, but they keep that container tight. And what they do is they sit in a circle and they spend probably a third of the time talking about where they are with physically, how they're feeling, mentally, how they're feeling, intellectually and spiritually. And when they don't really pony up and offer up really enough information, then the facilitator leans on them and says, come on now, you've got to deliver. You've got to give more. You're holding back. I can tell that you are. And the other guys in the group support them. They don't rag on them. They don't make fun of them. They don't fall into that old routine that is so detrimental to guys learning how to access and process their deeper feelings and emotions. They support him. Come on, man. Come on. I did it. You can do it too. And that's about a third of the time, because they go around the circle and they talk about it. And that alone was powerful enough. But then they also do other kinds of exercises and things that help them learn about ways to be better communicators. And then at the end, they do they do a processing of what they did and what they got from it. And I was sitting in that circle. I was there for a couple of days, a couple of winters ago, and there was a bunch of seniors. And there was this one young man at the very end who the entire time looked incredibly dejected. I mean, you could tell he was not in a good place and didn't want to talk. And so at the end, after they had done this little ball tossing, communicating little exercise, which really got the guys loosened up and laughing, he said, he's like sitting there, he's slumped over like a lot of young men do when they really, don't want to be engaged. And he said, all right, guys, you know what? I'm going to tell it to you straight. I don't want to be here. I'm failing almost all my classes. I don't think I'm going to even graduate. But I come because especially in the days when we have this, he said, because I'm here because of you guys. You guys keep me going. You guys keep me wanting to come. Man, you could have dropped a pin in that room. I mean, it was amazing, absolutely amazing. That is no small thing in an environment of young men who are extremely disenfranchised. And they're coming from environments where a lot of them are not being raised by fathers. A lot of them are being raised by grandmothers because their moms are working. So when you hear and see something like that, this is the kind of modeling that has been missing in their lives. And honestly, it's missing in a lot of boys' lives, regardless of color, regardless of socioeconomics. Yes, absolutely. A lot of middle and upper middle class, white young males are much luckier to have fathers in their lives. But they also do have a lot of divorced parents. And a lot of the boys I talked to who did come from middle and upper middle class backgrounds, attending private schools, their fathers weren't really that engaged in their lives also. So they're there, and it's better to have them there, of course. But what I'm trying to say is that there are, on so many levels, there are so many boys and men in this culture, young men, who really don't have fathers in their lives, really teaching them not so much rites of passage as much as ways to be accountable to themselves and in turn to other people, and ways to learn to control their anger and what the emotions are beneath that, to learn how to process that so that they can learn to gut check themselves. And that's one of the biggest things that I thought was so impressive about BAM. One of the biggest drops was in violent behavior of these boys in school and out of school. That's huge, because a lot of these boys were talking about learning through mindfulness techniques how to self-regulate. That's going to impact themselves and everybody else that they come into contact with. So these kinds of programs are really important, because I think that, even going beyond the South Side of Chicago, you can go into a lot of environments, I think, in even, these affluent private schools where a lot of boys and young men still need variations of these same messages because they don't get them, and they're really not learning, how to really deal with and process who they are in a deeper level. It's a way of understanding themselves, and in turn learning things that the toolkit that they need now in the classroom and the workplace: empathy, collaboration, communication skills. These are all things that boys at all levels aren't really expected to learn, but it's part of the toolkit that they need to succeed in the classroom and the workplace now.
Well, our audience is cheering you on here. There's a lot going on in the chat, including somebody who says, "BAM in Napa, please." And someone else who says that she runs a similar, I think it's a she, I'm not wearing my glasses, but that she runs a program similar to what you're describing, and how frustrated she is by the pushback that she gets from the schools that don't want to do it. And here's a question. What is your knowledge or evaluation of programs like Coaching Boys into Men and Live Respect that are meant to intentionally create spaces to educate and address what you're talking about?
Some of those programs are outstanding. There's a lot of them out there, and I write about some of them in the chapter of my book called Toxic Training, which is all about mostly high school sports and boys. There are some of these programs out there that are doing a great job. Coaching Boys into Men is doing a good job, but as you can imagine, there's a huge spectrum in terms of what they emphasize. Some of the programs I personally think are a lot better. There are programs out there that are really leaning more into this idea of character. And when we talk about character, it's not this kind of relativistic thing of, well, you can define character any way you want. But that it's teaching boys about accountability. It's teaching boys about when you are off the court or the field, you have a responsibility when you're in school or maybe even out of school to toe the line and to not allow bullying to take place, to do something and not be a bystander, let alone contribute to it. And so there are some programs that I feel are doing a much better job. And really that's got to come from the coach. And one of the things that I found time and time again when I would interview some of these young men who used to play contact sports like football was they talked endlessly about the way that the coach was the one who set the tone. And there were some sports psychologists that I interviewed who agreed with that. It all comes from the coaches. So yes, there are some programs out there that I think are finally seeing the light, and they're starting to realize that we need to get boys to learn things like empathy and compassion, believe it or not, that can be part of this character that they can have, during the game and outside of the game as well. But here's the thing. There's a lot of pushback with those programs, and there's not a lot of buy-in with a lot of coaches to those programs, because we live in a culture where it's not just all about winning and being number one, it's about dominating. And that's what I talk about in this chapter, Toxic Training. This isn't something that a lot of publications really want to run pieces on, but we do. We live in a culture of not just competing, but of dominating. And when you have a culture of domination, there are a lot of coaches that don't see these kinds of values as being easy to integrate when they're trying to teach these boys how to win. And that's the reason why there's a huge epidemic now in high school sports of, they call it hazing, but it's really sexual assault. right? You probably hear about this all the time in your schools, Barb.
We had that in Napa a couple of years ago, very serious incident of that. So yes.
They're everywhere now. They are everywhere in all sports now. It used to be just things like football or wrestling. It's pervading all sports now. And I write about this in the chapter, Toxic Training. That's about domination. It's about power, and it's about control. It's very difficult. A lot of these coaches feel like, well, we're going to make them too soft. They're not going to be able to compete and win and dominate if they're learning these other values. But the problem is that, and these coaches will say, boys, you need to flip the switch when you leave this game. When you get back out into the hallways, or when you get back, into parties, when you leave the school, you've got to flip the switch. You cannot expect.
It's not easy.
You can't excuse me. You can't expect high school age boys whose right hemispheres of their brains have not fully developed and won't until their mid to late 20s. You can't expect them to do that because they're much more reactive. And second of all, these boys who are playing these sports have received a constant message since Recreation League about the need to be tough. And being tough, there's no gray area with that. It's very much a binary. If you're tough, then you compete, and you play. Toughness means, showing no mercy, winning at all costs. And so these are the kinds of things that don't make room for the kinds of skill set that they're teaching in becoming a man. Coaches don't have the time or the interest, in most coaches, not all, but most, in how to integrate this, because it requires a lot more effort from them.
So let me ask you another question, because one of the things that you mentioned in the book, on page 65, by the way, I don't know why I wrote that down, is that boys really want to talk about how their life matters, that they are capable and needed in the world, which seems to me almost the last thing that we do in school. We are so busy trying to crunch standards into everybody's head that we forget about the fact that school should not be a process of preparing kids in first grade to go to second and second to go to third so that they have all the standards, but it should be about life. What is your life going to be after school? How will you fit into the world as a worker and as a father, as a community person? How do we change so that that is included? And do you think it would make a difference? Because we're the culture.
I mean, yeah, I think it would make a huge difference. And I think it would make a huge difference for girls and young women too. So another seminar that I teach, that I created, is called Leading Lives That Matter. And what I say to them on the first day of class is, we do it backwards in this culture. We say, you know what? You're going to go through vocational boot camp, high school and then college. And everything is going to be about getting out to get the job. And then you'll figure out who you are later. You really can't, if you don't have a sense of who you are, if you don't have that pipeline open with yourself to know who you are and what really feels authentic to you, it's really hard to have a clear understanding of what it is that you want to spend all that money to major in, and then go out and start working in that field if you're lucky enough to even get that job. And so really, it's really, we live in our culture so much from without. Everything about education, as you said, is about raising kids to be productive. Being productive in the sense of going out and getting that job and making the money. But so much of the social media that they're on teaches them to have their consciousness from without too. It's endlessly worrying about how you're fitting in and whether you're connected or you're going to be rejected. Nobody wants to be rejected. And so all of this is a consciousness from without. And there's no from within. There's no inner compass. And that's exactly what they need. When you have a program like a Becoming a Man or any variation on that, what you're teaching boys to do is to get a sense of understanding what matters to you at this point in your life. Who are you? What matters to you? What is going to give your life meaning and purpose? These are the kinds of questions we should be asking boys and girls. These are the kinds of questions we should be asking all of our students. And this is the kind of dialogue and conversation we should be having with them every single week. This is a really important conversation. To be honest with you, I think if we did this once a day for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, or maybe a couple times a week, if that's not realistic, maybe twice a week even, I think you would see a huge difference. I really do, in the anxiety levels and the depression levels. Because one of the things that I've noticed when I teach courses like Leading Lives That Matter are that students, I have them doing outside experiments that segue in with the things we're reading about and talking about. And there's things they learn about themselves that at the end of the semester, I just had a student email me at the end of the semester and say, you know, I feel like a different person. This course was like a guardian spirit for me. She said, I feel more courage than I've ever felt in my life because I'm learning about myself and I'm learning how to interact with people much more authentically and much more courageously than I was before. That's that inner compass that we have to teach them because no one else has the time or the energy or the interest in teaching them this. And we can't just feed them to the wolves. We see what it's doing to them.
So somebody asks in the chat, do you think that our prescriptions for masculinity have arisen from warfare? The idea that boys may have to risk their lives someday.
I think that's an important part of this idea of what makes for a competent man. You know, there's the idea of it's not by accident that a lot of boys become young men who really live for the opportunity and the chance to go into the war and prove themselves. You know, that is an age old, that is multi-millennia old mentality that a lot of boys have been kind of, that's one thing that we kind of, if there are rites of passage, that's one of the things that we tell boys. This is a way to prove to prove yourself. Mm-hmm. Is that a way, is that a way that boys should have to define themselves in terms of being men? Personally, I would say no. And I'm not saying that somebody shouldn't go into the military. What I'm saying is that it's important first to have a much better foundation about, having that pipeline open to yourself and having an understanding that you can still go off into the military and you can still even go off to war. But it's important that you've got a foundation where you've learned to access and process and even articulate the deeper parts of your being. You have the access to the full spectrum of your humanity. Because once you do that, I really do believe that would change a lot of the reflexes and impulses in the way that we view violence. I think it really would change a lot if we teach boys how to become men who can integrate all parts of their emotional lives into their humanity, and not to tell them this is separate and this is not who you are. We talked earlier about how we talk to boys at very young ages. It's not by accident that we don't teach them that they are emotional beings. We do a great job of that with girls, and we should do that with girls, but we should do it with boys too.
Do you have any recommendations for programs for adult men like this? Because now we know about BAM, and there are a couple of other programs that were mentioned. So something where they could become self-aware in a group rather than having to go for individual therapy?
Absolutely, yeah. And, there's been a big rise of men's groups in this culture that have really been springing up over the past 5 years or so. And that's not something really that requires a lot of formality. A lot of men's groups are facilitated by mental health care professionals, and that's always a good thing. But there also are guys who sometimes will maybe start off with, a mental health care professional in a men's group, and maybe they'll leave that and they'll facilitate it themselves because they see how it works. It's not that difficult, and they'll start meeting on their own. Basically, what you're doing in a group like that, is you're doing exactly what BAM does. Really, BAM got that model from men's groups.
Okay.
You're sitting in a circle. It can be as informal as you want it to be. And you talk about the things that, that it's really important for guys to learn to talk about the things that they're struggling with. Not just like, they're not looking for solutions, but the things that they've been going to girls and women for so many years. Talking about the things that they're struggling with on an emotional level. And being in the presence of other guys bearing witness to this and commiserating with that has huge repercussions for men. Huge repercussions. So many of the men I interviewed who've been involved in men's groups, and some of them not even that long, have found tremendous changes in themselves in terms of the way that they trust other men, in terms of the way that they, in turn, not surprisingly, engage with other men, and the way that they just feel that there's been this huge weight off of their chest.
Andrew, I'm going to stop you. Forgive me, but we are almost out of time, and I'm thinking that there are a lot of parents of boys who are listening right now, including Naomi, who's 4.5-year-old we met a few minutes ago. So what advice do you give to parents of young boys? What can they do differently? What can they say that will help them?
Well, first of all, I would say buy my book. First of all,
I would agree.
Please buy my book.
Wonderful.
This is a book. This is a book that is tailor-made for parents. I mean that with all sincerity. Buy my book.
Lots of important things.
Absolutely. No, seriously, read the book. It's one of the things we can start doing is, in a really small way, is talking to boys the way that we would talk to girls. Talk to them in ways that acknowledge and validate their beings as emotional humans. Talk to them in very simple ways. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. When a little boy, if your son comes in and, he's got he's looks very sad or very angry or very hurt, not just saying what's wrong, but saying whatever is bothering you, I bet it must really hurt inside of you. I bet you must be really frustrated. You look really sad. And I bet it's something that really must feel badly for you. Because what you want to do at the very least is acknowledge and validate the emotional reaction that they're having at that moment. One of the last things we want to do is invalidate a feeling, because we feel like, you know what, if I validate this feeling, he's going to grow up to be too soft. He's going to grow up to be too emotionally needy. That is, a competent man is somebody who knows how to be accountable for and to his own feelings. That, for my money, is one of the things that a competent man can do, is own up to and live up to his own emotions so that other people don't have to deal with the destruction of them. So validate boys' feelings.
That's a great phrase. It's a strip phrase that I think we can all keep in mind. That must really hurt inside of you. And if we can remember that and allow boys then to express that, we will have taken a pretty big step.
Absolutely. It's all about teaching them that they too are emotional beings, and that's part of who they should be and who they are.
Love it. It is 8:00, and Naomi told me we honor the 8:00. So I want to thank you so much. This was really fascinating. And everybody, here it is. You know where to buy it.
And I hope you guys will share my contact information in case people want to reach out and be in touch.
Oh, yes. I will do that. We'll send it to RSVP email. And also, this is going to be available for, it's been recorded. Somebody's going to put it up on YouTube. I will also share the recording to everybody, because I noticed that it's mostly, if not all, women in our group here.